Good morning. Want to welcome you to our first breakout session for the online induction conference for 2020. I am very excited to introduce our speakers for today's presentation this morning, which is utilizing the tools of cultural proficiency to address implicit bias. Our two presenters are two outstanding leaders in our field whom I respect greatly. We have Delia Estrada from Los Angeles Unified School District, who also works with Cal State University San Marcos. And joined with her is Letitia Bradley from Santa Barbara County Office of Education. And what's really great about Delia and Letitia is that they are two lead assessors for the Cal APA. So they have very intimate knowledge with regard to this topic, not only how it relates to schools, but also how it is so important to examine when early administrators, beginning administrators are coming into the field and start to grapple with many of these issues. So I am going to turn it over to them. And just as a reminder, this session is being recorded. So I just wanted to let everyone know that it will be available at the Commission's YouTube channel in mid-December. Delia and Letitia, I turn it to you now.
All right. Thank you so much, James. And thank you everyone for joining us today. I can't tell you how excited Delia and I are to be here with you. But we have a very short amount of time and we're going to be creating some things together, and we're going to create something together right now. So here's what I want to do. You've heard a little bit about us, but we want to know about you. But you're going to resist the urge to hit enter. We're going to create a waterfall together. So in this waterfall, in order for it to have the most maximum effect, and we got this idea from Dr. Nava, who's on this call with us, you're going to enter into the chat, but not hit enter, your name, where you're from, if you're a student or you're a part of a program, and one word or phrase that comes to mind. Do not hit enter, guys, because we're working together. That comes to mind when you hear the term implicit bias. And this is a safe space. So you can type anything that comes to mind when you hear that. And so I'm going to give you a second. You're going to put your name, if you're associated with an institution, maybe your position, and one word or phrase that you hear when you think of the term implicit bias. So I'm going to pause for about 5 seconds, and then I'm going to count you down, and we're going to look at our chat and create this waterfall together. Do not hit enter yet if you just joined us, because we're going to do this together. All right. So it sounds like you guys are ready because I see the trickle of the stream. All right, we're going to hit enter in 4, 3, 2, 1, go. And as you're doing that, we're seeing some amazing things come in. We're seeing words that will be popping out together. And as I turn it over to Delia to discuss the outcomes, we're going to be developing this common understanding and collective definition with respect to the term implicit bias. And we're going to invite you to remember what you typed just now. And when we go back at the end of the day, we're going to come back and see how these terms have either been affirmed or evolved over the course of our 40 minutes together. All right, Delia.
Okay. So before we begin with the actual presentation, there's something I'd like you to remember. I know many of you are leaders already in this field. I know a lot of you are doing this work with your candidates or for yourself. You're already doing, you're actually doing research on this, or it's been a thing of passion for you just from your own commitment. So I want you to be aware. Not only may have you read the book, you may have written the book, you may have taught the class. So what we want to do is come together and be able to share our expertise. Of course, we're doing a shorter version than we usually do, but please be aware. The opportunity is for us to discuss and learn together, okay? So it's an important that because we together prepare the educational leaders for the future. So without further ado, here are our outcomes. This is what we would like to achieve. Okay? We want to build a common understanding of implicit bias. 2, we want to introduce to you how to use the tools of cultural proficiency to address implicit bias. We also want to know and understand how implicit bias manifests in our work, okay? Not only in performance assessments, but in everyday practice. So we can go to the next slide. So we're going to begin with some essential questions. I want you to think about this. I am not. How would you finish those phrases? Just think about that. I'm going to model it for you, and I hope you have something readily available to you where you can just jot notes to yourself. I'm going to model this for you. I am Latina, multilingual, and single. I am not dumb, restricted by my language, and unhappy. So, seems particularly simple. Just take a minute and write it down for yourself. Okay, so I'm glad you've taken a minute to answer these questions for yourself. So here's my question for you. You can address it in the chat room, okay? Or if you're willing to share, you can tell us. But how did it make you feel to do this exercise? Just these simple questions. How did it make you feel to do that exercise? Empowered, challenged, engaged, empowered. Harder than I thought it was going to be. Affirmed, introspective. You got it right on the money. Even though it's a very simple exercise, what it's actually challenging to do is to not only see how you perceive yourself, but also how the world perceives you. That's what it's at the core of this work. Because we're negotiating that on a daily basis. We have to confront that. How do I see myself and how do others see me? This is essential, especially if we talk about bias, because it informs how we see the world and how we interact with the world. And it also defines the challenges we face. Next slide. Great word, vulnerable. So let's talk about equity. Is this slide, are these visuals familiar to you? We've been having this discussion for a long time. And the reason we're framing this as an ongoing conversation, just as the slide illustrates, it changes constantly over time. Our understanding of what equity, equality, access, okay, and what it means for our work is constantly changing. Look at the imagery. How are we approaching it? How are we defining the barriers? Who is included? Who is not included? These are dynamic, ever-changing things that we need to look at and address as we move forward. Next slide. And what I'd also like to share with you are tools that help us really deepen our understanding of what it means if we're going to work at addressing this issue, what it really means. So there are 4 tools under the culturally proficient framework. The first one is the barriers. So if we can click, it should circle it. There are actual barriers that we have to face, okay, when we're doing this work. And in order to face them, we have to understand what our own principles are, what we believe and what we're striving for. But at the same time, we have to acknowledge the barriers that exist. I know all of you in your experience have been through so many reform movements, and they've all had great goals. But without addressing the barriers or what's going to come up, it limits our effectiveness in dealing with them. And realize 90% of the work is actually dealing with that ethical tension between the barriers and what we say we believe. Okay, so if we can click again, and then click again, and then one more time. So those are the first tools. The next one is the continuum, the culture proficiency continuum. And we're going to go deeper into that one shortly. But what it actually gives us is a lens to see the behaviors that are around us and whether they are healthy or unhealthy. And the last one is the essential elements. They give us standards for our behaviors and for our work and how we can address these issues. Again, we'll get a little more into them later in the presentation. So, but we're first going to begin with actually looking at implicit bias. Next slide. And Letitia.
Thank you, Delia. So what you have up before you on the screen is a base level, straightforward, basic definition of implicit bias. We're not going to read to you, but what we're going to ask you to do is write in the chat the very first word that came to mind when you saw this description. So sometimes certain words pop up to us, and I want you to go ahead and write the very first one that really stands out to you. We're seeing a lot of different things. A lot of you are seeing automatic is one of the most common, unconscious. Very good. There's certain things that we're seeing this common thing, these assumptions. Very good. Now, here's the deal. And as you continue to write those in, because we love for everyone to participate, the reality is that with anything, you have the basic definition and then the subtle nuances, which give you a deeper understanding and a greater ability to utilize the information that you have. Remember, like we said earlier, we're honoring the fact that many of you could probably teach this for us, but we want to make sure that you're giving your expertise. So what we're going to do is we're going to add to this collective definition. And on the next slide, we can go ahead and click that. The next slide, we're going to see a short video. We'll be doing a series of videos in which we are building and adding to this definition together. So let's go ahead and take a look at this first one.
Implicit bias.
Implicit bias.
Implicit bias.
2016 was the year that implicit bias went somewhat mainstream.
Yeah, so when Hillary Clinton mentioned implicit bias in the debates, our phones started blowing up, all our friends started emailing us about it.
But what is implicit bias? Implicit biases are basically thought processes that happen without you even knowing it. Little mental shortcuts that hold judgments you might not agree with. And sometimes those shortcuts are based on race. First, some clarity. Saying someone has an implicit bias is different from calling someone a racist.
The word racist is a highly loaded term, right, here in American society. A lot of times, when people are using it, they're thinking of the kind of old-fashioned Ku Klux Klan style racist.
But implicit bias isn't anywhere near that, explicit.
Implicit bias is something that comes out of ordinary mental functioning, out of how the mind normally works.
We've all grown up in a culture with media images, news images, conversations we heard at home, our education. Think of that as a fog we've been breathing our whole life. We've never even realized it, what we were taking in.
And that fog causes associations that lead to biases.
I somehow know that if you say peanut butter, I'm going to say jelly. That's an association that's been ingrained in me because throughout my life, peanut butter and jelly are together. And in many forms of media, there is an over-representation of Black men and violent crime being paired together.
And because of that, I actually deep down inside have been taught that Black men are violent and aggressive and not to be trusted, that they're criminals, that they're thugs.
With all those associations, I'm not trying to let us off the hook, but in some ways, none of us stood a chance.
Starting today, we'll post a video a day dealing with one challenge of understanding implicit bias and its relationship to race and exploring ways we might combat the problem. One more thing, if you're seeing this and thinking that it doesn't apply to you, well, you might be falling prey to the blind spot bias. That's the scientific name for a mental bias that allows you to see biases in others, but not in yourself. We're biased.
All right. So as we're seeing, this video is giving us a little bit more that we're adding to this automatic unconscious thought process, associating stereotypes with groups of people. So I would like for you to take a moment and tell us in the chat what did this add to your collective understanding? Remember, we're building this definition and understanding together. What stood out to you in the video that took it beyond the basic definition of implicit bias? Great, we're seeing media images. The concept of the blind spot bias was very new to me as well. Brain functioning, very good. And as I see this pouring in, we really are appreciative of you taking the time to participate with us. What we're noticing is that we're taking it from this basic level of, oh my goodness, it happens automatically, and we're building on this idea to understand the underlying subconscious aspects that impact us all, right? So let's go ahead and somebody said they really enjoyed the peanut butter and jelly analogy. I did too. Let's go ahead and click to the next slide. And what we have here, just take a second to look at this. And it's one of those kind of things that's kind of in our face and real and true. We all have biases, and it's part of being human. It's nothing to be ashamed of, but it matters, right? And so we need to move from this space of this automatic thing that was initially essential to our survival. In earliest times, our ability to identify and spot differences may have been the difference between life and death, or it may have helped us identify members of our tribe, fruits and things that are helpful and harmful. And it's something that we have to be aware of in an ongoing basis. And our work to understand these automatic processes is what we are encouraging all of us to actively participate and continue to do as we move forward. We have to remember our why and why we are, not only understanding bias, but addressing it in a systematic fashion is helpful. And so we're going to take a look at some work from John Amici Obe, and he's going to give us another layer to our definition. Let's go ahead and look at this video on the next slide.
Let's if we can, try to define what exactly is that covert, that subconscious bias. What exactly does that mean?
So I struggle sometimes with the language that we use, because the unconscious is a thing. It is a concept in psychology, and bias is a real thing. But we mix the two together, and it's a very unclear picture. I've talked before about the fact, and you've heard here with Jamelia and others, the things that people have done. And the moment it lives in the real world and not in our head, it stops being unconscious. So if someone walks towards me and because whatever, they cross the street, the act of crossing the street is quite a conscious act. The fact that it's derived from a nebulous, difficult to define feeling that's inside them of discomfort is one thing, but it doesn't make the act of crossing the street, the act of not hiring a person, the act of whatever it is, questioning whether you should be in the neighborhood or whatever, it doesn't make that an unconscious act. So these are subtle behaviors, but if you are on the receiving end of that, it's not particularly subtle. When people cross the street, when they see you coming, it's pretty obvious. And after a while, that trend has a real impact.
So with that, there was a kind of a difficulty in defining that. So if it's so difficult to define, how on earth do you even tackle it?
It's not too difficult. For most people watching this, you will have had a wince moment, a moment that you can think back on right now, where you had an uncomfortable interaction with someone who's different than you. It might be somebody who's perhaps a wheelchair user. It might be an LGBT person. It might be a Black person. But you'll have a wince moment where the differences between you suddenly crystallized in you, and you had a sense of urgency, a sense of panic, a sense of I don't know what to say or do. And you may have even at that point misstepped. You may have even had that wince moment when you just abdicated responsibility to stand up when that sexist joke was told or when that racist thing was said. You can learn from those moments. That discomfort can be a teacher. But what you have to do is acknowledge you have them. One of the problems with defeating this everyday racism is the idea that people don't want to address the fact they think it's the worst thing in the world to consider that they've ever done anything biased, but we all have. Embracing that can prevent us from making the same mistake again. Ignoring that makes us a dangerous weapon in society.
And really quickly, how have you dealt with it? Very quickly, if you can, John. If you can.
I try, as a psychologist, to believe the best in people. I maintain that that is the way forward, and I hope that this will be a pivotal moment for change for everybody.
Okay, John Amici, really good talking, and some really good advice there as well. Thank you.
Thank you. So now we're going from this subconscious, unintentional, my goodness, I might not even have any control over it definition, to an understanding that's a little bit more nuanced. So how might what you saw in this new video add to our collective understanding of this idea of implicit bias, and what is our duty as equitable leaders? So let's go ahead and take time for the chat. And we appreciate you guys participating in this part, because we understand we normally would have loved to have people come on the mic and answer and participate orally. But with so many wonderful participants, the chat is our most useful tool to get you engaged. And so we appreciate you. Delia, are you seeing anything that's popping out?
Self-awareness, being able to acknowledge it within ourselves first, right? Really having that growth mindset that you allow this new information in, that even small responses to your students or to each other have impact. Tolerating, tuning in, I love this, tuning in and acting on the discomfort, right? Leading into the wins and acknowledging it.
Yes, I appreciate that. And what's interesting and most important about this idea is that even if it's unconscious, unintentional, and potentially well-meaning, the overt implications are undeniable. And it shows up in things such as the demographics we see in leadership, in education, despite the number of other demographics in the ranks. There's so many ways that this pops up, and we have to start thinking about the impact on the system and how our decisions could impact others if we fail to address our own internal biases. On this next slide, we're going to talk about this idea of our system. And it's important to always see the system that produces the outcomes. There's a saying that the system gets the results it was designed to get, and that is very, very much true. Are we able to see how our system how bias impacts our system? Do we acknowledge it? Is there something that we can do to make sure that we're addressing it? Our assumptions and our beliefs, they trigger things and actions that have far-reaching implications, and it's imperative that we create the system and society that we wish others to inherit. And the only way to do that is by some of the tools, especially those that Delia was speaking about in the coming slides, to examine our progress, our system, and what steps we might take to impact it going further. So now we're going to go with one more video. And on this next video, I have to let you know that the subject matter is one that for some can be triggering, but without violence. And so it's not a violent video by any stretch of the imagination, but it talks to you about the power of words. And so we're, again, layers to this definition. And let's go ahead and take a listen to this one.
This is one of the ways that dominant systems maintain and reproduce themselves, which is to say the dominant group is rarely challenged to even think about its dominance, because that's one of the key characteristics of power and privilege, the ability to go unexamined, lacking introspection, and in fact being rendered invisible in large measure in the discourse about issues that are primarily about us. And this is amazing how this works in domestic and sexual violence, how men have been largely erased from so much of the conversation about a subject that is centrally about men. And I'm going to illustrate what I'm talking about by using the old tech. I'm old school on some fundamental regards. I make films and I work with, high tech, but I'm still old school as an educator. And I want to share with you this exercise that illustrates on the sentence structure level how the way that we think, literally the way that we use language, conspires to keep our attention off of men. This is about domestic violence in particular, but you can plug in other analogs. This comes from the work of the feminist linguist Julia Penelope. It starts with a very basic English sentence. John beat Mary. That's a good English sentence. John is the subject, beat is the verb, Mary is the object. Good sentence. Now we're going to move to the second sentence, which says the same thing in the passive voice. Mary was beaten by John. And now a whole lot has happened in one sentence. We've gone from John beat Mary to Mary was beaten by John. We've shifted our focus in one sentence from John to Mary. And you can see John is very close to the end of the sentence, well, close to dropping off the map of our psychic plane. The third sentence, John is dropped, and we have Mary was beaten, and now it's all about Mary. We're not even thinking about John. It's totally focused on Mary. Over the past generation, the term we've used synonymous with beaten is battered, so we have Mary was battered. And the final sentence in this sequence, flowing from the others, is Mary is a battered woman. So now Mary's very identity, Mary is a battered woman, is what was done to her by John in the first instance. But we've demonstrated that John has long ago left the conversation. Now, those of us who work in domestic and sexual violence field know that victim blaming is pervasive in this realm, which is to say blaming the person to whom something was done rather than the person who did it. And we say things like, why do these women go out with these men? Why are they attracted to these men? Why do they keep going back? What was she wearing at that party? What a stupid thing to do. Why was she drinking with that group of guys in that hotel room? This is victim blaming. And there are numerous reasons for it, but one of them is that our whole cognitive structure is set up to blame victims. This is all unconscious. Our whole cognitive structure is set up to ask questions about women and women's choices and what they're doing, thinking, and wearing. And I'm not going to shout down people who ask questions about women. Okay, it's a legitimate thing to ask. But let's be clear, asking questions about Mary is not going to get us anywhere in terms of preventing violence. We have to ask a different set of questions. And you can see where I'm going.
Thank you. So now this topic of language and the power that it has to shape and impact how we see others and ourselves. Remember when the exercise in the very beginning where we talked about what we were and what we are not. And in some cases, it is a constant dance where we have either a disconnect or we actually have the same vision that others have for ourselves. And so Delia is going to talk a little bit about kind of this concept of words, but I want to give you an example. And I am a person who is very excited that now I live in a nice place, I have a roof over my head, but at one point in my youth, if not more than one point in my youth, I was a student who experienced homelessness. But think about how sometimes seemingly innocent description can have power. Now, was I a homeless student, or was I a student experiencing homelessness? If you call me a homeless student, there's a whole level of baggage that is attached to that now impacts how you see me, interact with me, and the expectations that you have for me. I'm experiencing this, however, there may be a trigger and or a commitment that this is something that is temporary, that can change, as opposed to something that is a part of my identity. And it's imperative that we are careful about the way that we utilize language, because it reinforces some of the most negative and some positive aspects of society.
And I love what someone just shared. It impacts your psyche when you're categorized. If we can go to the next slide.
This is one of the ways that dominant systems maintain and reproduce themselves, which is to say the dominant group is rarely challenged.
Here we go. This may look familiar to you, the California dashboard. And look at the language we're using. Now, most of these are well-intended. What they're meant to do is be able to identify needs for students. But again, as Letitia so well pointed out, is it a student who's experienced a condition, or are we labeling them? And here is something else going on. Just because a group may be small in proportion to the other groups, it doesn't mean they're not experiencing anything. So for instance, if you look for American Indian or Alaskan Native, it says none, as if they don't exist. And yet there are trends and things that they are managing and dealing with. It does not make them invisible. Remember, as we do this work, we are breaking through not only this invisibleness, but also being able to acknowledge the needs. Again, going with Letitia's example is, what if it's not a special needs student, but a student who needs specific support? So think about that. And when we switch that language, the responsibility of managing it switches too. Because if a student needs specialized services, we provide the specialized services. It changes our thinking. If I know a child is experiencing homelessness, then I know there's things and adaptations I need to do so they can have access to the things they need. If I know that a student is learning a language, is dominating two languages or trying to dominate two languages, okay, what services do I need to provide to make that happen? So again, that shift in mindset and making the invisible visible. Okay, next slide. And this is where the tools of cultural proficiency really come into play. Again, this is the continuum. And as you see, it moves from, right to the left to the right, showing a way to look at behaviors. So let's take the first one, cultural destructiveness. So the usual big examples of this, people will talk about where people are deliberately targeted, okay, and to be eliminated. And of course we have the genocide, the Holocaust, how Native Americans were treated and their land stolen from them. All of these are absolutely valid. Slavery, all of this actually destructive. But a lot of times when you say, oh, well, that's historical, they'll be dismissed, without acknowledging that this actually happens on school sites. And as a former principal, I can tell you this. What are the things students or barriers students have to jump over in order to get into an AP course? Do we have conditions? Or is one school that told me, oh, they have to have straight A's and their past English classes for 4 years before they could get into an AP class. Okay, that's destructive. Destructive in the sense that you are destroying that child's opportunity to take on that challenge. So they have to be rethought. There's also cultural incapacity, where people are described, well, if those parents cared more, oh, well, they don't value education. Have you heard that? So you see the blame is being shifted to the target group. Oh, it's something wrong with them. It has nothing to do with me. Then this one too, and this is where implicit bias lies, cultural blindness. It's pretending not to see it or not acknowledging or not even aware. Let's go with this example of the student experiencing homelessness. If I know that they're negotiating that on a daily basis, okay, can I really sit there and say, well, that paper better be due or you flunk the class? Or can an adaptation be made? Understanding what they're negotiating. When people say, I love this phrase, oh, I don't see color, I see kids. Well, if I don't understand the conditions that child is experiencing, then how can I make good adaptations? And by the way, everyone needs an adaptation. Everyone does. So let's really look at it. And what does it mean for what we do? Then there's cultural pre-competence. And these are the behaviors that start shifting us in the right place. Are you aware of what's going on? And are we aware that there are things we can do? This is a really important stage because this is where people are vacillating. They're figuring it out. They're uncomfortable. Okay. And as a great professor once told me, when you feel uncomfortable, lean in. That means you're learning. And so this is where we help people come on. But it's also a very dangerous spot because they can slide in their defensiveness, go back, okay, to the left side of the continuum. So now we want to move them and say, no, there's something you can do. Cultural competence. I'm going to try something. I'm going to do something. I'm going to figure out what works. Okay? What we can do. And it's okay if it doesn't work, but go in there, jump in there, experiment, figure it out. Look for the assets. Remember the list we saw? Those are, we put those in deficit. What are the assets that occur in the community and how can you build them? And cultural proficiency is you've learned the lesson and you're going to apply it to our everyday functioning in schools. If we can see this, if we can learn to see our work this way, we have the ability to build a new world. Next slide. This is really the bottom line. If we're truly going to be equity-driven leaders, and by the way, when I say leaders, I just don't mean administrators. Every teacher is a leader, every TA is a leader, everyone on that campus is a leader, okay? It's really for moving from unhealthy, destructive behaviors for everyone to healthy behaviors. Coaching people into that, having discussions, active discussions about this, so that we can create healthy, flourishing communities that let every child figure out their strengths and for them to blossom. Next slide. And we do this, okay, remember, these are the standards, by assessing our cultural knowledge, valuing diversity, and looking for very different perspectives on the world. So for instance, I always like pointing this out to people. You want to know the one person on campus that knows the teacher who needs the most support and the teacher who's struggling the most? I'll tell you who it is. The plant manager. Because they're cleaning up whatever's going on in that classroom. And they will tell you. Everyone, every perspective. And the one perspective that's usually ignored, the student perspective. We need to find those perspectives and bring it into our thinking. Also, we have to have particular ways of managing the dynamics of difference. We all assume people can know how to manage difference. No, we have to be intentional and ways of being able to handle conflict. Conflict is natural, but we can get really skilled at handling it. And knowing that we're always adapting to diversity and engaging in that, and that we institutionalize our knowledge. Next slide. Okay.
So now we're going to talk about, sorry. So now we're talking this idea of what is something that we can do. And we know as equity-driven leaders, we're always in this process of learning. And so we like to kind of discuss this concept of the importance of reflection and dialogue. And so think for yourself for how you utilize the tool and what is the difference. And so these are very powerful tools to help us move across the cultural competency continuum. And so with reflection, you're having a discussion, a thought-provoking process where you're thinking about the system and how actions impact outcomes. And then dialogue is this discussion with others in this. One is internal and one is external. And so we want to start thinking about what ways that we can use this fundamental process to increase our understanding within our organizations and move our cause forward. So on the next slide, what we're going to do is we want to kind of take a quick moment because we're really running low. We're having such a good time with you in this dialogue. And we're going to talk about some resources. So what we have done is we've put about 6 resources on the screen, things that many of you may have already read or find intriguing, and some that you may not have heard of yet. So take a look at the different resources. And then for those of you that have one, we'd love for you to put in the any resource you have found particularly helpful as we all are on this journey of increasing not only our understanding of bias, but in putting additional tools in our toolkit so that we can do something about it. So go ahead and put in the chat if you have a resource, because we're going to save this chat and to kind of see what you guys are reading and or interacting with at this time. So as you guys go ahead and put those in, I invite you all to take a moment and look at this list. Add something to your Amazon cart after we're done. And if you already have this in your library and you've used it, pass it on to someone else so that they can share that knowledge.
By the way,
right, so
recommendation, Cast, great book. Yes.
Yes. Wonderful. There's some great things I'm going to be adding to my list.
Yes. I guess we should go to the last slide, Letitia, because we have run out of time.
I agree. That would make the most sense.
Yeah. So we don't have time to do the video, do we?
I believe it's 10:50. We do.
Yeah, we have 10 minutes.
Okay. Oh, perfect. So everyone, I want to prepare you for this. This video can be very disturbing. So we're going to give you a minute after you see it. Okay. But it tells a great truth that we have to contend with, particularly as educators and actually just as human beings. So let's run it, but take time. It is going to be hard to watch.
Quale bambola è bianca? Quale bambola è nera? Quale delle due è bella?
Questa.
Qual è quella bella? Qual è quella brutta? E qual è quella buona? Quale è cattiva? Qual è buona?
Lei.
Perché è buona?
Perché ha gli occhi celesti.
Quale è cattiva? Perché è cattiva?
Perché è tutto nero.
E qual è la bambola che ti somiglia di più? Quale bambola è nera?
Mi ha offeso. Tu. Perché mi hai chiamato nero?
Perché ti offendi?
Mi offendi perché altri bambini mi hanno offeso con cattiveria.
No, io non ho usato nessuna cattiveria.
Quello mi sta guardando storto.
Just gonna give you a minute. It's been said that public education is failing. And we know that's not true. And we've taught many lessons. And we've been very good at it. And this is the lesson that we've taught. It's time for a new lesson. Bruce Matsui from Claremont Graduate University taught me that the world is built on our beliefs and assumptions, that we create the world we live in. So if we want a world, then we must teach the lessons that say every child, which is written in every mission statement I've read all over the state, is worthy and has a place in the world and should be respected. And I would argue to have the ability to learn and discover all the wonderful things in this world and to be loved. Teaching is the greatest act of love, and that's why I've dedicated my life to it, and I know Leticia has as well. So I have a final thought for you. Next slide. We don't have to wait for some grand utopian future. The future is an infinite succession of presents, and to live now as we think human beings should live, in defiance of all that is bad around us, is in itself a marvelous victory. We've invited you to a discussion that we will continue. And I know me, Leticia, Marco, and Kitty, who will be presenting this in the afternoon, we're working on it on a daily basis, and we hope you join us. Thank you for being here and listening to us. Leticia, any final thoughts?
I just want to echo what said Delia, is that we are on this awesome because we collectively care about the future of our society. Together, if we intentionally, purposefully, and on a regular and ongoing basis examine things within and within the system, we will not have the same outcomes that we have had previously. But it takes work and it takes courage. So thank you all for spending your time with us, having the courage to build a collective increase our collective consciousness and build our common definition and deepen our understanding of implicit bias. And thank you for sharing the resources with us and the gift of your time. We appreciate you. And thank you, James, for being our tech guide on the side.
Absolutely. And thank you to everyone who has participated in all the wonderful things you're saying in the chat. Just as a reminder, we will have this recorded and uploaded to the CTC's YouTube channel, and we do want to have the resources available to you as well. Just in a time check, it is 10:57, so we are going to end this session, and then reminder that you have your next session, and then it will be time for lunch. So just wanted to give everyone a way to look at the rest of the morning. So I hope you enjoy your next session. Remember that you have to log out of here and then access the Zoom link that is on your agenda for what you would like to attend next. Again, Delia and Leticia, thank you so much for sharing all your wonderful expertise. I thoroughly love to continue working with both of you, and it is an honor to hear you speak because every time I hear it, I always gain something new. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And I just wanted to note that someone asked about the video, the TED Talk in the chat. We'll make sure when we post the resources that we have the links for all videos for you as well.
And also some of them are much longer, but really great resources. By the way, I need to do a shout out to Howard Zinn, historian, who it's a People's History of the United States, one of my favorite books. I needed to make sure that was where the quote comes from. And he always inspires me.
Thank you, everyone.